Hey guys, this is Dave, and I have the iBasso DX260 MK2. Of course, this lands right in between the DX180 and the DX340 here. The DX180 being their entry-level DAP at $529, and then the DX340 is their flagship DAP, and this is priced at $1,700. This is priced at $999, and again, this being the MK2 version, I would expect to see some upgrades over the original. So of course, we will talk about that, but the bigger question is, does its sound performance reflect its nearly $1,000 asking price? Well, that's the question I'm going to try and answer in today's video. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. Okay, so again, they have priced this at $999, and this is everything that comes in the box. We've got some screen protectors, we have a basic clear silicone protective case, a 4.4 balanced burn-in cable, a coaxial cable, so if you wanted to, you can use the DX260 as a digital transport to an external DAC. You then have a USB Type-C cable. On the front of the device, we have a really nice 5-inch sharp 1080p display. The outer chassis of the DAP is made out of metal, and then on the back, there is a removable panel, and that gives you access to the battery. The build quality is really good. It feels robust, and it not only looks like what you might expect from a higher end device, but it really feels like one too. The volume feels nice. The buttons are placed well. They have good tactility. And again, the case is pretty plain. I do prefer how it looks without the case. It just looks absolutely stunning. And again, you can just see the build quality is excellent. And this is the silver white backplate, but there is also a darker silver blue option available as well. On the right side is the volume wheel and your playback controls. And on the top is a 2 terabyte compatible micro SD slot, a USB Type-C output and charging port, and then a coaxial output, which again, that's what the coaxial cable is for. Then finally, on the bottom are the 4.4 balanced and 3.5 single-ended headphone outputs. And then moving to the internals, we'll go ahead and talk about the audio hardware and some specs first, and then we'll talk about processing and software. So this has an Octa DAC configuration. So it uses 8 CS43198 DAC chips. They've also implemented their FPGA Master 2.0 as the audio system controller, along with some other pretty impressive engineering. Bottom line though, is that if you are into specs, they were able to achieve some pretty impressive numbers, like an SNR of 133 dBs, a DNR of 134 dBs, and then a THD plus N of minus 123 dBs. So that definitely earns some bragging rights just right there. Power output is also pretty impressive with 1015 milliwatts and 6 volts RMS of level output out of the 4.4 balanced output, and then 280 milliwatts and 3 volts RMS of level output out of the 3.5 single-ended output. And that is with a 32 ohm load. Of course, this can decode all of your higher bitrate audio formats like 32-bit PTM and DSD256. You have wireless connectivity, including Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, of course. And now moving over to the processing hardware and software side, side. As far as some of the differences or upgrades over the original DX260, they've upgraded the internal memory from 64 gigs up to 128 gigs. They've also upgraded the processing chip from the Snapdragon 660 to the 665, and they've gone from Android 11 and jumped up to Android 13. And while I actually don't have the original DX260 to compare UI responsiveness, I do have quite a few other pretty nice dApps. And while the UI certainly is not as fast as something like, I don't know, a new phone with the newer Android version, it is still pretty snappy and responsive, and is at least as fast or maybe even faster than a lot of the other dApps that I have. So the user experience has actually been really satisfactory for me. And speaking of the UI, let's quickly talk about some of the audio options and software. So again, the Mango player is of course the music app that comes stock with the DX260 MK2, and it can be used to play all of your onboard music files. And since you have 128 gigs of internal storage plus the expandable 2 terabyte compatible micro SD slot, that means you can store a ton of music on this DAP. But you can also download all of your streaming apps as well from the Play Store, like Qobuz and Amazon Music. And if we dive a little deeper into the settings, you will find some additional sound options like gain modes, output modes, digital filters, and car mode. And then you can also access a graphic or parametric EQ within the Mango player as well. One last thing before we move on to sound, this has a 4,400 milliamp built-in battery that is actually accessible, as I said earlier, by removing the back panel. iBasso claims 14 hours of battery time, but I think that might actually be maybe a bit high. Although of course it's going to really come down to your listening habits. So volume levels, screen brightness, and lots of other variables, but I don't think it's too far off. Oh, and then another difference between this MK2 version and the original is that this version does allow you to operate off of external power and will allow you to bypass the battery if you're plugged in again to an external power source. And there really isn't a lot more I guess I could talk about, but I think that covers most of the main features and specifications. So let's go ahead and move on to sound. Okay, so let's quickly go over some of the gear that I paired this with. So I tested it with several headphones and IEMs, including the Sennheiser HD800S right here, the Aria Stealth, LCD3 2022, the Meze Elysian 2 Poet 109 Pro, FIO FT7, but also some mid-tier stuff like the 105 AR, 105 Silva, the new Moondrop Para, Meze 99 Classic, and more. Plus, I also paired it with a lot of IEMs ranging from higher end sets like the Diva, Monarch MK3 to mid-tier and budget sets like the i600, the Pilgrims, Studio 4, Vulcan 2s, and many others. Then I also compared this with some of these other DAPs within its price range, including the Hibi R6 Pro Max and the Onyx XM10. And then of course, I've got my reference DAP, the DX340. I do not have, nor have I heard the original DX260. So aside from what I've read or heard about the original DX260, I don't know if there's really any actual sound improvements with the MK2, although we do know from a hardware and software perspective, they have made some upgrades. And I will talk about those in a minute, but let's go ahead and talk about drivability. So in terms of power output, this is going to drive just about any full-size headphone. I was able to drive my 300 ohm HD 800S to very, very loud volumes quite easily. It also drove my planar sets very well, like my LCD3s. And just to give you some points of comparison, the DX260 MK2 can put out, again, 1015 milliwatts. The Onyx XM10 here cost $899, and this is going to give you about 877 milliwatts. And then the R6 Pro Max is $999, and that's going to give you 697 milliwatts of output. Now, one other thing to note is that the original DX260 has the exact same power output, and as far as I can tell, both versions, as far as their internal components and their specifications, I did not see any differences at all. So again, while I haven't heard the original, based on what I've seen, my guess is there likely is not going to be really any sound improvement over the original DX260. But back to drivability again, with its 1015 milliwatts and 6 volts of level output, there isn't going to be much out there that this will not drive pretty well. I mean, I'm sure there are going to be some sets out there, but this should drive most everything just fine. So when comparing its power output with some other DAPs within this price range, you can see that it's actually one of the more powerful DAPs out there for $1,000. But then compared with its bigger brother, the DX340, it's only going to give you about half of the output of the DX340. So the DX340 is capable of putting out 2150 milliwatts, and that's out of the balanced output in DC mode. So again, the DX340 really does step that power output up a notch, but it also steps the price up quite a bit as well. Bottom line though is that for this $1,000 price point, if you have headphones, even some that might be a little harder to drive, as long as you don't have anything that's unusually hard to drive, you're going to be just fine. Then of course I tested noise levels with my Andromedas and I heard no background noise at all. So it's very, very quiet. So that should give you an idea of how versatile this device is, because you know you have enough power to drive almost any full-size set, but it's also delicate enough for sensitive IEMs. And for me, while I do certainly like having that feeling of confidence that if I want to travel with a full-size set, and I do almost always take at least one set of full-size headphones when I travel, but I will typically bring multiple sets of my nicer IEMs. And believe it or not, there have been lots of times where I will actually bring the DX260 with me and then leave my DX340 at home. And I will explain why later, but for me, there are actually some small advantages or benefits of the DX260 over the DX340. Even though this is iBasso's mid-tier DAP, I actually feel very confident that I'm not really compromising that much in the way of sound quality with my higher end IEMs and headphones. So how does it sound? Well, before I actually started doing any comparisons, my initial sit down and my initial impression with this device by itself was that it did have a very linear sound. So I didn't notice any coloration at all, other than to say the treble had maybe a little bit of a smoother, or maybe I should say refined presentation. And while I don't feel like the DX260 MK2 leans warm or falls into that musical category, I do feel like the treble presentation is, again, I don't know if I'd call it smooth, because I can still hear lots of detail and I'm still able to experience that upper treble airy sensation with certain live recordings. However, I do feel like its presentation is, again, what I can only describe as maybe a little bit smooth and definitely refined. So that was my first sit down. Then, as I got further into the review process and really started doing comparisons and trying different IEMs and headphones, I do feel like I was able to really kind of understand better what iBasso was going for. And I think the terms that kept coming to mind were refined, pure, and transparent. And that's also basically the same kind of impressions the DX340 gave me, but just maybe to a slightly higher degree. But to get back to the overall presentation of the DX260 MK2, I would say that initial linear and neutral impression it gave me, it did seem to carry through pretty consistently in the rest of my comparing and my testing. And there wasn't really much in the way of coloration or any kind of variance in its timbre. And what was true on that macro level was also true on a closer micro level as well. And if we do take a little bit of a closer look, starting with the bass levels were not boosted, and the mid bass and sub bass all seem to have, again, a very nice linear, very natural presentation. It maintained excellent bass detail and texture, and basically all the bass characteristics that were present in a recording as far as extension, punch, texture, they all seem to be very well represented with the DX260 MK2's presentation. I felt the same way about its mid-range presentation. Instruments and vocals sounded very natural. I didn't notice any coloration in the mid-range. It wasn't overly warm, but if there was any richness in instruments or male vocals in the recording, that was still presented in the presentation of the DX260 MK2. Now, as far as the treble presentation, that also struck me as just being very accurate and very natural. It sounded detailed and open. It gave me all of those little micro nuances and air in the treble. Of course, if the IEMs or headphones were capable of reproducing that, and if that was present in the recording soundstage, imaging, forward layering, separation were also excellent, and maybe not end game levels of technical performance, but certainly close, and certainly at levels that I would expect from a device in this price range. So what about comparisons? Well, as I said, I have these 3 other DAPs on hand, 2 of which are pretty close in price, and these are the Onyx XM10, as I said, the Hibi R6 Pro Max, and I will just tell you right now, all 3 of these are pretty incredible, and I would recommend any one of these. And I think anyone would probably have a pretty difficult time trying to hear any sonic differences between any of these players. They're all that good. And I have not reviewed the R6 Pro Max yet, nor the XM10, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but I will say that each of these are going to give you a pretty linear or neutral presentation and will also give you lots of power. That said, I did feel like the DX260 MK2 had just a slightly more reference type of presentation. So it's maybe a little drier, I guess. And while it did give me pretty impressive detail levels, plus it had excellent timbre and just a very natural presentation, again, compared with these 2 DAPs, it was just a little bit drier and uncolored. And again, I would still consider the other 2 to be within the general range of linear, but with maybe just a little bit of coloration. Now, I need to go back to what I started to say about the advantages of the DX260 MK2 over the DX340. In terms of pure sound performance, the DX340 is still going to outperform the DX260 MK2. And for now, of course, it does remain my reference DAP. However, I would say there is not really that big of a jump up in performance from the DX260 MK2 to the DX340. There is a jump up, but it's not a big one. So when I'm traveling and I want to take my higher end IEMs or headphones, while I know the DX260 isn't necessarily going to give me DX340 levels of transparency and detail, I do feel like it comes really close. Close enough to where, unless I'm doing a side-by-side comparison or doing some really serious critical listening, most of the time, I feel like I'm getting all of the detail and transparency that I need. And I can pair it with my nicer sets and not feel like I'm compromising their sound performance. But the advantage of the DX260 MK2 over the 340 while traveling is obviously it's more compact, it's lighter, and it's just easier to transport. Now, granted, its screen is smaller than the 340, and it's also smaller than the Pro Max and the XM10. But for me, if I'm traveling, I am much more likely to reach for the 260 MK2 over any of these other DAPs. Now, of course, if I want to travel really light, then I'll just bring a dongle. But even then, sometimes I would just prefer to not have anything attached to my phone and just use a DAP. Now, I will say that one interesting thing about the XM10 is that it has a large screen, but it's got a really thin body, and that's pretty unique for DAPs. And I have taken this on trips, and I did like it, but it is still kind of heavy. In any case, the DX260 MK2 for me has proven itself to be very, very impressive. And I guess in summary, if I'm going to be spending $1,000 on a DAP, my expectations are going to be high. And while I think these other two are, again, they're great options, especially if you like a more substantial or weighty feel, or you just prefer more girth in your DAPs, which I know some of you do, and I know I do if I'm not traveling. And the R6 Pro Max definitely does that for me. And then of course the DX340 definitely has that girth and weight as well. But if you are looking for something maybe a little more compact and light, but is still going to give you close to a reference level presentation and give you not just, again, uncompromised sound quality, but excellent build quality and a ton of versatility and features, then I would definitely recommend that you consider the DX260 MK2. So that concludes my review of the iBasso DX260 MK2 DAP. If you are new to the Giz Audio channel and you like our videos, please take a minute and hit that subscribe button. And if you want to go a step further, you can also support us through our Patreon. I'll make sure and leave a link in the description. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch this review. Please like this video, please share this video. I hope you have an awesome day.